Hello and welcome to the channel. The story you're about to hear is about the most carefully constructed illusion in American history. Not the movies themselves, but the lives of those who made them. What happens when an entire industry builds its fortune on selling romance, while forcing the people who create that romance to hide who they truly love? These weren't just careers at stake in many states. Their love was literally criminal. The year is 1933, and William Haines sits across from Louis B. Mayer in an office that overlooks the MGM lot. Through the window, he can see sound stages where he's made millions of dollars for this studio. The office smells of cigar smoke and expensive cologne. Mayer's desk is mahogany, massive, positioned so visitors must look up at him like supplicants approaching a throne. Mayer doesn't waste time with pleasantries. The ultimatum comes plain and simple. Marry a woman, any woman the studio chooses, or the career ends. Today, now, forever. Haines has known this moment was coming. The whispers have grown louder, the gossip columnists more pointed in their blind items. A handsome bachelor in his 30s who never seems interested in marriage in Hollywood. That's not mysterious. It's suspicious. The studio has arranged dates, orchestrated photo opportunities, manufactured romances that fooled precisely nobody who mattered. But manufacture can only take you so far. The public wants marriage. The morality clauses demand it. And Mayer, who controls everything and everyone under his domain, expects obedience. William Haines looks at the most powerful man in Hollywood and says no, not because he doesn't understand what he's losing, not because he's naive about what comes next. He says no because at his home in the Hollywood Hills, Jimmy Shields is waiting. Jimmy, who he met years ago, who moved in quietly and never left. Jimmy, who makes him laugh, who understands the exhaustion of performing for the cameras all day, who is there when the makeup comes off and the real person emerges. Jimmy, who is worth more than any role, any salary, any amount of fame. I'm not going to marry some dame just to keep my career. Haines tells Mayer. The exact words would be remembered, repeated, become legend. But in that moment, sitting in that office, they simply mean what they mean. No performance, no acting, just truth. Mayer's face darkens. In the studio system of the 1,930 seconds, this man holds power that would make kings jealous. He decides who works, who doesn't, who rises, who falls. He has ended careers for less than disobedience, crushed people who merely annoyed him. And here is William Haines, one of his biggest assets, refusing a direct order. The meeting ends. Haines walks out of the MGM lot for the last time as an actor. The blacklist is immediate and total. Not just MGM, every studio gets the message. William Haines will not work in Hollywood again. Phone calls that used to come daily stop. Scripts that arrived by messenger service dry up. Friends in the industry, terrified of association, drift away. In an industry built on who you know and who knows you, Haines becomes invisible overnight. He's 33 years old. Most actors would call it a death sentence. Instead, Haines goes home to Jimmy and asks a question that will change both their lives. What do movie stars need besides movies? The answer comes quickly. They need beautiful homes. They need someone who understands their taste, their lifestyle, their need for privacy and glamour in equal measure. They need an interior designer who speaks their language. William Haines becomes that designer. The career that follows spans 4 decades. The same stars who couldn't be seen with him at parties hire him to design their homes. Joan Crawford, Carole Lombard, Jack Warner, Samuel Goldwyn. The list reads like a Hollywood directory. He designs with bold colors and clean lines, mixing antiques with modern pieces in ways nobody else dares. He makes more money than he ever did acting. He builds an empire while living openly with Jimmy in their home, creating spaces where beauty and authenticity coexist. They travel together, work together, build a life together. 50 years they share that house. 50 years while the industry that exiled Haines continues churning out romances, manufacturing dreams, forcing other actors into the same choice he refused to make. 50 years while others hide and marry and perform and break. Haines dies on the 26th of December 1973. He's 73 years old, successful, respected in his second career, still sharing his life with the man he refused to betray. Jimmy Shields, who gave up everything when Haines walked away from Hollywood, who could have left 1,000 times for someone with an easier path, survives him by only weeks. The grief is too much, the house too empty, the life they built together too singular to continue alone. On the 11th of January 1974, Shields takes his own life. They're buried together. No studio executive attends the funeral to explain why the choice was necessary, why William Haines had to choose between love and career. No morality clause justifies why two people who harmed nobody, who loved quietly and built beautifully, had to hide it all. But here's what remains. William Haines is the only major star of his era who chose love over career and survived, not just survived, but thrived. He found a way to live authentically in an industry built on lies. He proved that walking away from the machine doesn't mean walking away from life itself. The question that haunts is simpler. How many others could have made the same choice if they'd known another path existed? How many brilliant performances were lost because people spent their energy maintaining the performance of their lives instead? We'll never know, but we know that one man, when faced with the ultimatum, looked at power and said no, and lived. His real name was Roy Scherer Jr. He grew up in Winnetka, Illinois, a small town boy who was tall and handsome but not particularly special. He drove trucks after high school, served in the Navy during World War II, came home without any clear direction. Nothing about Roy Scherer suggested he would become one of the most famous men in America. Nothing suggested he would die in a way that changed everything. The transformation began in 1948 when Henry Wilson saw him. Wilson was a talent agent with a particular specialty. He created stars the way other men created products. He manufactured images, invented backgrounds, and above all, he renamed people. Roy Scherer became Rock Hudson. The name was constructed like a matinee idol, solid as rock, strong as the Hudson River, masculine, powerful, utterly American. The publicity machine started immediately. Photos with starlets, carefully choreographed dates, gossip column items about which actress had caught Rock's eye this week. The studio system knew how to build a leading man, and they built Rock Hudson perfectly. Tall, square-jawed, with a smile that could sell anything. He learned acting on the job, got better with each film, and by the mid-1950 seconds, he was exactly what Hollywood needed. A romantic hero for the post-war era. In 1955, the studio decided Rock Hudson needed a wife. Her name was Phyllis Gates. She worked as Henry Wilson's secretary, which tells you most of what you need to know about the arrangement. The wedding was covered by every major publication. The marriage lasted 3 years before quietly dissolving. No children, no scandal, just a divorce that everyone agreed to forget. It had served its purpose. Rock Hudson had been married. The questions could stop now, except they never really stopped. Did they? Because while Rock Hudson played the romantic lead in film after film, Magnificent Obsession, All That Heaven Allows, giant opposite James Dean, his real life unfolded elsewhere. In private homes, at parties where the guests were carefully selected, in relationships that couldn't be photographed or discussed or acknowledged. The ultimate irony came in 1959 with Pillow Talk, Rock Hudson and Doris Day, the perfect romantic comedy couple. He played a playboy pretending to be someone else to win her over. The film made $75 million. Audiences loved watching Rock Hudson seduce Doris Day. They loved it so much they made 2 more films together. For years, moviegoers' idea of perfect romance was Rock Hudson and Doris Day, the man who couldn't be himself playing a man pretending to be someone else, layer upon layer of performance. And somewhere underneath it all, Roy Scherer from Illinois, trying to breathe. His real relationship was with Mark Christian. They met in 1982, began living together, built something that resembled a normal life, except for the absolute necessity of secrecy. Christian was 30 years younger, an aspiring actor himself who understood the rules of Hollywood's closet. They traveled together as friends, lived in the same house as roommates, maintained the fiction because the alternative was unthinkable. In 1984, Rock Hudson felt sick, fatigue, weight loss, symptoms that might mean anything or nothing. The diagnosis came back with a name that was just beginning to terrify America. Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, AIDS. The gay plague, the media called it. The disease killing thousands while the government looked away and the president refused to even say its name. Hudson kept working. He took a recurring role on Dynasty, playing one of the glamorous characters in that opulent soap opera. But hiding became impossible. On the 21st of July, 1985, he collapsed on set. The photos from that period are devastating. The handsome leading man transformed into a gaunt figure. Skin stretched over bone, the decay visible and undeniable. He flew to Paris for experimental treatment. The photos at the airport showed him on a stretcher, barely conscious, a dying man trying one last desperate hope. When the treatment failed, he flew home to Los Angeles. And then he did something that nobody in his position had ever done before. On the 25th of July, 1985, Rock Hudson's publicist released a statement. The biggest romantic leading man of his generation, the man who had symbolized masculine heterosexual desire for 3 decades, announced that he had AIDS. The news exploded across every front page in America. The disease that had been killing people in silence suddenly had the most famous face imaginable. Rock Hudson died on the 2nd of October, 1985, at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 59 years old. Mark Christian was there, though the obituaries didn't mention him except as a friend. The funeral was private. The mourning was public and enormous. But something happened in the wake of his death that had never happened before. AIDS became real to America. When it was nameless, people dying in silence, the country could ignore it. When Rock Hudson, handsome, masculine, all-American Rock Hudson died of AIDS, suddenly it was a crisis that demanded attention. Funding for research increased. Public awareness spread. The man who had spent his career hiding became, in death, the face of a disease that forced America to see what it had been ignoring. Mark Christian sued Hudson's estate, claiming Hudson had kept the diagnosis secret even from him, potentially exposing him to the virus. The lawsuit was ugly, public, everything Hudson had spent his life avoiding. Christian won millions in damages. He tested negative for HIV but died of pulmonary complications in 2009, never having escaped the shadow of Rock Hudson's death. What remains is the question Rock Hudson never got to answer. What might his life have been if he could have lived it honestly? If Roy Scherer from Illinois hadn't needed to become Rock Hudson, the manufactured fantasy? If the man who made audiences believe in romance could have had his own romance in daylight? The cameras captured him kissing Doris Day, embracing dozens of leading ladies, playing the role of masculine desire so perfectly that people believed it without question. But the camera never captured what was real. It never showed Mark Christian, or the other men before him, or the life Rock Hudson actually lived when the set lights dimmed and the makeup came off. He lived the lie so perfectly that he became its greatest victim. He gave audiences what they wanted and paid for it with everything that mattered. And when he finally told the truth, it was only because dying made the secret impossible to keep. They called him the most beautiful man in movies. The camera loved Montgomery Clift in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Those eyes, that face, the intensity that poured through the screen like nothing audiences had seen before. He brought something new to Hollywood, something raw and vulnerable that made the established stars look like they were performing in a different language. He came from theater, from Broadway, where actors trained in craft rather than charm. Method acting before it had that name, before Brando made it famous. Clift was already doing it. He disappeared into roles, found truth in moments that other actors would play for effect. When he arrived in Hollywood for Red River in 1948, John Wayne, the epitome of old-school movie star masculinity, looked at him and reportedly said, "You're going to be a big star. You've got it." Even Wayne recognized something unprecedented. But Clift carried within him a split that would never heal. He was attracted to men. He was also attracted to women. In 1,950 seconds America, there was no language for fluidity, no space for complexity. You were one thing or another, normal or deviant, acceptable or criminal. Clift existed in neither category and both, loving men and women with equal authenticity while Hollywood demanded he pretend to love only the latter. Elizabeth Taylor understood him. They met filming A Place in the Sun in 1951, and something clicked between them that went deeper than friendship or romance. She saw him completely, the genius, the torment, the impossible position of being everything Hollywood wanted while being unable to be himself. They became bonded, protective of each other, in an industry that devoured vulnerability. The accident happened on the 12th of May, 1956. Clift left a dinner party at Taylor's house in Beverly Hills. He'd been drinking. He was usually drinking by then, but not so much that anyone worried. He drove down the winding road from her home, missed a turn, and crashed his car into a telephone pole. The vehicle wrapped around the pole, metal crushing inward. Clift trapped inside with his face smashed against the steering wheel. Taylor heard the crash. She ran down the hill in the darkness, still in her dinner dress, and found him. His face was destroyed, blood everywhere, teeth knocked loose, some driven back into his throat where they could choke him. She reached into his mouth with her bare hands and pulled the teeth out, kept him breathing until the ambulance arrived, saved his life in those minutes before help came. But the face was never the same. The bones were broken in multiple places, jaw, nose, cheekbones. Surgeons did what they could, but this was 1,956, before modern reconstructive techniques. They wired his jaw shut, rebuilt what they could, sent him home to heal. When the swelling went down and the wires came out, Montgomery Clift still looked like Montgomery Clift, but the symmetry was gone. One side of his face didn't quite match the other, the left side partially paralyzed, giving him a frozen quality in certain angles. The most beautiful man in movies now carried his trauma visibly. He went back to work, finished Raintree County, the film he'd been shooting when the accident happened. The studio had insurance, could have replaced him, but Taylor insisted they wait for him. In the finished film, you can see the before and after scenes shot prior to the accident show the perfect face. Scenes after show the damage. Critics later said he'd never been better, that the pain added depth to his performance. Maybe Or maybe they were watching a man who no longer had the energy to hide what he was feeling. The pills started in earnest after the accident. Pain medication at first, legitimately prescribed, then sleeping pills, then pills to counteract other pills, then alcohol to smooth the edges of everything. Clift began the slow dissolution that everyone around him could see but nobody could stop. He took roles, showed up on set increasingly unreliable, forgot lines, needed dozens of takes. Directors who loved him made excuses, protected him when they could, but protecting Montgomery Clift was like trying to hold water in your hands. His sexuality never became public scandal, but it wasn't exactly hidden either. He had relationships with men, some brief, some longer. He had relationships with women, Libby Holman, others. He seemed to be searching for something he could never find. Comfort that didn't exist in a world that required him to choose categories he didn't fit. Elizabeth Taylor cast him in suddenly, last summer in 1959, playing a doctor, treating a woman institutionalized for seeing something horrible. The irony of Clift playing a psychiatrist while barely holding himself together wasn't lost on anyone. He could hardly function. Taylor protected him, covered for him, did whatever she could to help him finish the film. His last films are painful to watch. The young man who brought such electricity to the screen became a hollow thing, reading lines he could barely remember, unable to access the talent that had made him extraordinary. Directors grew frustrated, then pitying, then simply sad. John Hudson, working with him on The Misfits and later Freud, watched a man falling apart and could do nothing. Montgomery Clift died alone in his New York townhouse on the 23rd of July, 1966. He was 45 years old. His longtime secretary found him the next morning. A heart attack, the official cause. But everyone knew the truth. The pills, the alcohol, the decades of pain and hiding had finally consumed everything. Elizabeth Taylor received the news while filming. She released a statement that cut through Hollywood's usual platitudes. He was the most honest person I ever knew, and Hollywood destroyed him for it. What was that honesty? Perhaps it was simply that Clift couldn't perform himself the way he performed his roles. Other actors learned to be straight for the cameras, to manufacture romance and normalcy with the same craft they brought to scripts. Clift couldn't or wouldn't. The split between his public and private selves created a wound that never healed, one that he tried to numb with pills and liquor until nothing remained but the attempting. The accident gave him an external scar to match the internal ones. The face that had been too beautiful became marked, and perhaps there was some relief in that no longer perfect, no longer required to maintain the illusion of perfection. But the relief, if it existed, came with such pain that it offered no comfort. What remains is the work from those early years. Before the crash, the intensity in Red River, the vulnerability in A Place in Sun, the barely contained passion in From Here to Eternity. In those films you can see what was lost. The talent that Hollywood couldn't protect because it required protecting from Hollywood itself. The most beautiful man in movies, who had to hide what would have destroyed him to reveal, and was destroyed by hiding it instead. He was born Archibald Leach in Bristol, England, in 1904, into poverty so complete it defined everything that came after. His father worked in a garment factory. His mother, struggling with mental illness, disappeared when he was 9 years old, committed to an institution, though his father told him she had died. Archie Leach learned early that the truth was negotiable, that survival sometimes required inventing a better story. He ran away at 14 to join an acrobatic troupe, learned to walk on stilts, do flips, perform for audiences who wanted spectacle and charm. He learned timing, learned how to hold attention, learned that performance could be a way out of the Bristol slums. The troupe toured America, and when they returned to England, Archie Leach stayed behind. In New York, he worked vaudeville, played small roles, refined the accent that would become his trademark, not quite British, not quite American, something else entirely, an accent that came from nowhere real, that belonged only to the person he was inventing. By the time he reached Hollywood in the early 1930 seconds, Archie Leach had died. Cary Grant was born. The name came from a studio list. They always had lists of names, combinations of words that sounded like stars. He took it and made it mean something, became it so completely that decades later he would say, "Everyone wants to be Cary Grant. Even I want to be Cary Grant." But who was Cary Grant? He played the perfect gentleman, the sophisticated leading man, the embodiment of masculine elegance. Tall, dark-haired, with a cleft chin and that impossible accent. He moved through romantic comedies and thrillers with effortless charm, made screwball dialogue sound natural, wore tuxedos like they were casual wear. Audiences fell in love with him. Women wanted him. Men wanted to be him. And none of it was real. In 1932, Grant met Randolph Scott, another actor trying to establish himself in Hollywood. They moved in together, two bachelors, sharing a house at the beach to save money. The publicity story went, perfectly reasonable for the Depression era. Nothing to see here. The house was at 1018 Ocean Front in Santa Monica. Photographers took pictures of them there, lounging by the pool, cooking breakfast together, living a domestic life that should have raised questions, but somehow didn't. Or perhaps it did. But the studio publicity machine was powerful enough to control the narrative. They lived together for 12 years. 12 years of magazine spreads, showing two handsome bachelors in their beach house, swimming together, hosting parties together, existing in a space that should have been suspicious but was instead sold as aspirational male friendship. When one of them married, Grant married twice during this period. Scott, once the other, stayed in the house, waiting. After each divorce, they resumed living together. 4 marriages between them during those 12 years, and after each one ended, they came back to the beach house and each other. The photographs from that era are remarkable. Not because they show anything explicit, they don't, but there's an intimacy in them that no amount of just friends explanation can quite cover. Two men comfortable with each other in ways that go beyond friendship, casual in each other's presence in ways that suggest much more. Grant's marriages have their own story. 5 wives across 50 years, each marriage shorter than the last. Virginia Cheryl, Woolworth heiress Barbara Hutton, actress Betsy Drake, actress Diane Cannon, hotel publicist Barbara Harris. These were real relationships with real people. Not all of them lavender arrangements, but something in Grant kept him from settling, from finding whatever he was searching for. He was generous to his wives, never spoke badly of them, but he couldn't be what they needed him to be because he was too busy being what the world needed him to be. In the late 1950 seconds, Grant began taking LSD. This was before it became recreational, when it was still being explored as psychiatric treatment. He went to therapy sessions under its influence, trying to understand himself, trying to break through whatever was blocking him from actual intimacy. He later described it as the most important thing he'd ever done. "I was hiding from myself," he said in one interview. Hiding what? He never specified, but the implication hung there. He remained friends with Randolph Scott until Scott's death in 1987. They saw each other regularly, maintained a connection that outlasted all of Grant's marriages. The nature of that connection remained undefined, undiscussed, locked behind the persona of Cary Grant, the perfect gentleman who never revealed anything unseemly. Grant retired from acting in 1966, at 62, while he could still play romantic leads. He'd made millions, become one of the most successful actors in Hollywood history. He spent his later years on corporate boards, living comfortably, occasionally granting interviews where he talked about the craft of acting, but never about the cost of performance. He died on the 29th of November, 1986, in Davenport, Iowa, of a stroke. He was 82 years old, preparing to do a one-man show where he would talk about his career. Barbara Harris, his fifth wife, was with him. He died as Cary Grant, the perfect gentleman, the accent intact to the end. But Archie Leach, the boy from Bristol, the one who learned that survival meant performance, the one who invented a person so thoroughly that he disappeared inside it, what happened to him? He vanished somewhere around 1930 and never came back. Cary Grant said once, "I pretended to be somebody I wanted to be until I became that person." Or he became me. The line between performance and reality erased so completely that maybe even he didn't know where one ended and the other began. The perfect masculine ideal turned out to be exactly that, an ideal, a construction, a performance so consistent that it became indistinguishable from truth. Every gesture measured, every word in that invented accent carefully delivered, every moment in public controlled. The exhaustion of it seems impossible to comprehend. To wake up every day and perform yourself. To never drop the mask, because dropping it means losing everything. Randolph Scott knew something. The Five Wives knew fragments. Elizabeth Taylor, who worked with him and understood hidden things, probably knew. But Cary Grant, the perfect gentleman, never broke character, never gave the interview where he explained himself, never wrote the memoir that told the truth beneath the performance. The accent covered everything. The charm deflected all questions. The perfect gentleman remained perfectly impenetrable. And somewhere underneath, Archie Leach from Bristol, who learned that the truth was negotiable and survival required invention, watched from behind the construction and kept his secrets forever. She arrived in Hollywood in 1930, already famous, already dangerous, already unlike anyone America had seen before. Marlene Dietrich came from Berlin, from the cabaret culture where gender was performance and sexuality was fluid, where artists pushed boundaries because boundaries were meant to be pushed. She brought that freedom with her like contraband, smuggled into an industry obsessed with control. Joseph von Sternberg discovered her, or perhaps she allowed him to think he had. He cast her in The Blue Angel in 1929, a German film where she played a cabaret singer who destroys a respectable professor. The role made her an international star. Von Sternberg brought her to Hollywood for Morocco, where she would play opposite Gary Cooper and become one of Paramount's biggest assets. The famous scene comes early in the film. Dietrich's character performs in a nightclub, wearing a tuxedo and top hat, masculine clothing that transforms her from woman to something else, not man, not woman, something that transcends the binary. She walks through the audience, singing, commanding attention. Then she approaches a woman, leans down, and kisses her full on the mouth. The year was 1930. The Hays Code, which would censor American cinema for decades, hadn't yet been enforced. Dietrich's kiss was allowed on screen, and audiences didn't know what to do with it. Some were shocked, some were thrilled, all of them were fascinated. Here was a woman who looked at categories and walked right through them. Dietrich's bisexuality wasn't hidden, wasn't coded, wasn't presented as subtext for those clever enough to read it. She simply lived as though the rules didn't apply to her because, in many ways, they didn't. Paramount had invested too much money. Audiences loved her too completely, and she was foreign enough that American expectations couldn't quite stick to her. She was other, and being other meant she could do things that would destroy an American actress. Her relationships with women were numerous and occasionally public. Mercedes de Acosta, the writer and socialite who had affairs with half of Hollywood's elite women, pursued Dietrich for years. They had an affair that de Acosta later wrote about, describing Dietrich's magnetism, her refusal to conform, her absolute certainty in her own desires. Edith Piaf, the French singer, shared Dietrich's bed in Paris. There were others, actresses, socialites, women whose names were whispered at parties but never printed in newspapers. Her relationships with men were just as numerous. Jean Gabin, the French actor, had an affair with her that lasted years. John Wayne, that icon of American masculinity, fell for her despite, or perhaps because of, her refusal to play by conventional rules. She had affairs with directors, actors, musicians, whoever interested her at any given moment. She collected lovers the way other people collected stamps, not from compulsion, but from genuine appreciation of human beauty and complexity. In Europe, it doesn't matter if you're a man or woman, she said once. You love who you love. It sounds simple, but in 1,930 seconds America, it was revolutionary. While other actors were getting married to hide themselves, while studios were enforcing morality clauses and destroying careers over whispered rumors, Dietrich simply shrugged and loved who she wanted. Her marriage to Rudolf Sieber lasted from 1923 until his death in 1976, 53 years on paper. But it was a marriage of profound understanding rather than conventional fidelity. They lived on separate continents for much of it. He had his relationships, she had hers, and they remained devoted to each other in ways that confused people who thought marriage meant ownership. Their daughter, Maria Riva, later wrote about her mother's life with a mixture of admiration and exasperation, documenting the affairs, the passion, the absolute refusal to be constrained. When World War II came, Dietrich made a choice that put her life at risk. She was German, one of the biggest stars Germany had produced, and Hitler's government wanted her back. They offered her anything, money, status, films, whatever she wanted if she would return and make movies for the Third Reich. She refused. More than refused, she became an American citizen in 1939 and spent the war entertaining Allied troops, often near front lines, showing up in uniform to sing for soldiers who were fighting her native country. The USO tours took her to North Africa, Italy, and eventually Germany itself. She performed in bombed-out theaters, in camps, anywhere soldiers gathered. She was nearly 50 years old, still beautiful but no longer young, and she worked harder than performers half her age. She sang in the cold, slept in military quarters, put herself in danger because she believed in the cause. The Nazis declared her a traitor. Her family, still in Germany, was harassed, threatened. She kept performing. The freedom to love who she wanted came from understanding that freedom required defending. She saw what fascism did to people who didn't conform, saw the death camps, saw the systematic destruction of anyone who refused to fit predetermined categories. Her sexuality wasn't just personal preference, it was political resistance against forces that wanted to control human desire. After the war, she continued working, continued living as she always had. Her career lasted into the 1,970 seconds, eventually transitioning from film to concert performances. She would appear on stage in gowns covered in crystals, singing in multiple languages, commanding attention the way she had in Morocco 40 years earlier. She aged visibly, refused plastic surgery, let time mark her face, because she had no interest in pretending to be something she wasn't. Her later years were spent in Paris, increasingly reclusive, living in an apartment filled with memories and photographs. She gave interviews by telephone, but rarely appeared in public. Maria Riva cared for her, navigating the complexity of a mother who had been larger than life, more than one person could reasonably be. Marlene Dietrich died in Paris on the 6th of May 1992 at age 90. She was buried in Berlin in the same cemetery as her mother, returning finally to the country she'd left decades before. The funeral drew thousands Germans who remembered her from before the war, Americans who'd grown up watching her films, French citizens who'd adopted her as their own. What remains is the question she answered by living. What happens when you refuse to choose? When you insist on loving men and women both? When you reject the binary that everyone else accepts? For Dietrich, the answer was freedom, genuine freedom, the kind that came from being too valuable to destroy and too certain of herself to compromise. She showed that another way was possible, if you were brave enough and powerful enough to demand it, that sexuality could be fluid, that gender could be performance, that the rules were only rules if you agreed to follow them. But she also showed how much that freedom required the courage to lose everything, the strength to be called traitor, the willingness to be foreign and other and beyond American understanding. Most people couldn't afford that price. Marlene Dietrich could, and she paid it gladly, and she lived exactly as she wanted until the very end. He came from Fairmount, Indiana, a town so small it barely registered on maps. James Byron Dean, born the 8th of February 1931, raised by his aunt and uncle after his mother died when he was 9. The Midwest shaped him the farms, the flat horizons, the conservative values that defined post-war America. He left as soon as he could, first to California to study theater, then to New York to become a serious actor. Broadway gave him small parts, television gave him more. He studied at the actor's studio, absorbed the method, learned to channel emotion through his body in ways that made other actors look mechanical. Directors noticed him. Casting agents remembered him when Elia Kazan needed someone to play Cal Trask in East of Eden, someone who could embody adolescent rage and vulnerability simultaneously. He chose James Dean. The film released in 1955. Dean was 24 years old, playing a teenager, desperately seeking his father's approval. The performance was raw, physical, sometimes painful to watch. He moved like someone barely containing violence, spoke like words heard coming out. Audiences had never seen anything like it. Neither had Hollywood. While Dean was becoming famous, while Warner Brothers was preparing to make him a star, while publicity machines were manufacturing his image, rumors were already circulating. There was Rogers Brackett, the older advertising executive and radio director who Dean had lived with in the early 1950 seconds. Brackett had connections, introduced Dean to people who mattered, helped his career in tangible ways. They took trips together, spent weekends away from Los Angeles, maintained a relationship that was mentorship and something more. The studio knew, of course. Studios always knew. But Dean was young, unmarried, not yet famous enough for his private life to matter. The publicity department focused on manufacturing romance, with actresses Pia Angeli, primarily an Italian actress whose dark beauty photographed beautifully beside Dean's blonde intensity. The relationship was real in some way, complicated in others. Angeli's mother disapproved, pushed her toward Vic Damone instead. When Angeli married Damone, Dean reportedly circled the church on his motorcycle during the ceremony, unable to stop her, but unable to stay away. Whether Angeli knew about the men, whether she cared, history doesn't record. She died by suicide in 1971, and whatever she knew about James Dean went with her. Rebel Without a Cause, filmed in 1955, released posthumously. Dean played Jim Stark, a teenager whose anger has no clear target, whose parents provide everything except understanding. The film captured something essential about American adolescence: the rage, the confusion, the desperate need for authentic connection. Dean's performance made it clear this wasn't acting. This was something deeper, more dangerous, closer to the bone. Sal Mineo played Plato, the younger boy who worships Jim with an intensity that goes beyond friendship. Mineo himself was gay, would die tragically in 1976, murdered in an alley behind his apartment. Years later, he talked about the filming, about Dean, about what everyone on set understood, but nobody said. We all knew about Jimmy, Mineo said. Not judgment, just fact. In 1955 Hollywood, you knew and kept your mouth shut. Giant was Dean's third and final film. He played Jet Rink, a ranch hand who strikes oil and becomes wealthy, but never becomes happy. The role required aging from young man to middle-aged millionaire. Dean threw himself into it the way he threw himself into everything completely, obsessively, without reservation. He finished filming in September 1955. The movie wouldn't be released until 1956. Dean would never see it. He loved speed. Motorcycles first, then cars. He'd bought a Porsche 550 Spider, silver with racing stripes, customized for performance. His friends worried. His insurance company worried. Warner Brothers wrote into his contract that he couldn't race while filming. The day after Giant wrapped, Dean registered for a race in Salinas, California, the 30th of September, 1955. He was driving the Spider north on Route 466, bringing it to the race, testing its limits on public roads. The intersection at Cholame appears suddenly. Another driver, Donald Turnipseed, pulled onto the highway without seeing the low-slung silver Porsche. Dean's car hit Turnipseed's Ford Tudor at high speed. The Porsche crumpled, metal folding inward, the impact catastrophic. Dean's passenger survived with serious injuries. Dean died almost instantly. Massive internal injuries, neck broken. He was 24 years old. He'd been famous for less than a year. The news traveled fast. 3 films, 3 iconic performances, an entire career compressed into months. Giant hadn't even been released yet. When it finally premiered in 1956, audiences watched James Dean age into middle age, knowing he'd never actually get there. The ghost of a future that would never happen, preserved on film. The rumors about his sexuality intensified after death. Brackett gave interviews decades later, confirming what many suspected. Others came forward with stories, encounters, relationships, moments that suggested Dean's attractions weren't limited by gender. But these revelations came too late to hurt him, too late to damage the career he'd already lost to a highway intersection and bad timing. What remains is speculation, fragments, things people said decades later when it no longer mattered. Would Dean have come out if he'd lived? Would the studio have forced him into marriage like Rock Hudson? Would he have hidden like Montgomery Clift until hiding destroyed him? We'll never know, because death gave him something the others never got: the ability to remain forever young, forever ambiguous, forever free from the choices that destroyed other actors. Sal Mineo said it best. We all knew about Jimmy, but Jimmy never had to confirm or deny, never had to choose between truth and career, never had to watch himself age while pretending to be someone he wasn't. The Porsche 550 Spider wrapped around another car at Cholame, and James Dean became permanent at 24, young, talented, tortured, and mysteriously intact. The icon who never aged, frozen forever on film, his secrets preserved by death rather than revealed by life. Perhaps that's its own tragedy, not what we lost, but what we'll never know. The questions that can't be answered because the only person who knew for certain died on a highway in 1955, becoming legend precisely because he never lived long enough to become merely human. He was tall, awkward, intensely sensitive, the kind of young man who seemed uncomfortable in his own skin. Anthony Perkins, came from theatre royalty, the son of actor Osgood Perkins, but inherited more anxiety than confidence. His father died when Anthony was 5, leaving him with memories too fragmentary to fully process. He grew up shy, uncertain, the opposite of the bold masculinity Hollywood usually demanded. Broadway discovered him first. He could act, that was clear, but there was something else, a quality of vulnerability that made audiences protective. When he transitioned to film in the mid-1950 seconds, directors saw it too. William Wyler cast him in Friendly Persuasion. Joshua Logan put him in Tall Story. He was nominated for an Oscar for Fear Strikes Out, playing a baseball player suffering a nervous breakdown. Even then, the typecasting had begun the sensitive boy on the edge of collapse. Then came Alfred Hitchcock and Psycho. The role of Norman Bates should have destroyed Perkins's career, or at least limited it severely. He played a man so dominated by his mother that he becomes her, murders women in her name, loses himself completely in maternal identification. The performance was chilling precisely because Perkins understood something essential about Norman. He wasn't a monster. He was a boy who never grew up, trapped in a relationship that consumed his identity. The film released in 1960 and changed everything. Perkins became permanently associated with Norman Bates, the mama's boy, the weak man, the one who couldn't establish masculine independence. In an industry obsessed with strong male heroes, Perkins had become the definitive portrait of masculine failure. And beneath the performance, beneath the character, was a truth that Perkins himself was still trying to understand. He met Tab Hunter in the late 1950 seconds. Hunter was everything Perkins. Wasn't blonde, all-American, the kind of masculinity that Hollywood could sell without complication. But Hunter was also gay, living carefully in the closet, navigating the same impossible terrain as Perkins. They began a relationship that lasted years, conducted in private, hidden from the press, protected by the same studio machinery that manufactured their public images. The relationship with Hunter was real, but it terrified Perkins. Being gay meant being Norman Bates in the public imagination, weak, dominated, unable to perform proper masculinity. The connection between homosexuality and mental illness was accepted medical fact in the 1960 seconds. The American Psychiatric Association classified homosexuality as a disorder. Conversion therapy was standard treatment. Perkins, already anxious and uncertain, decided to try to fix himself. He underwent therapy designed to make him heterosexual. The methods varied: talk therapy, behavioral modification, encouragement to date women, reinforcement of masculine behaviors. The underlying assumption was constant. Homosexuality was a deviation that could be corrected with proper intervention. Perkins tried desperately to believe this. He dated women, formed relationships, attempted to redirect his attractions through sheer force of will. The therapy lasted years. Whether it worked depends on how you define success. Perkins did eventually marry a woman, Berry Berenson, a photographer and actress, in 1973. They had 2 sons, Osgood and Elvis. By all accounts, the marriage was genuine. Berenson loved him. He loved her. They built a family, created a life that looked from the outside like the heterosexual ideal the therapy had promised. But something in Perkins never quite settled. He continued to struggle with the question of his sexuality, continued to wonder if he'd successfully changed himself or merely learned to perform heterosexuality the way he performed roles on screen. The distinction mattered enormously to him and perhaps didn't matter at all to anyone else. His sons grew up with a father who loved them. His wife had a husband who was devoted to her. The internal confusion was his alone to carry. His career continued, more films, more roles, inevitably returning to Norman Bates in sequels that nobody asked for but everyone watched. Psycho 3, Psycho 3, Psycho 4. Each one reinforcing the connection between Perkins and damaged masculinity, between Anthony and Norman, between the actor and the character who defined him. In the 1,980 seconds, he began feeling sick, fatigue, weight loss, the symptoms that were becoming grimly familiar in certain communities. The test came back positive, HIV. In an era when AIDS meant death, when public disclosure meant career destruction and social exile, Perkins kept the diagnosis secret. He continued working, continued maintaining the image of the devoted family man, continued hiding one more thing in a life built on careful concealment. He died on the 12th of September 1992 at his home in Los Angeles. He was 60 years old. The official cause was AIDS-related pneumonia. The obituaries mentioned his wife and sons, his role as Norman Bates, his Broadway work. Some mentioned the HIV, some didn't. None fully grappled with the complexity of a man who'd spent decades trying to therapy himself straight, who'd built a real family while never quite resolving who he actually was. Barry Berenson released a statement that cut through the speculation. He made me so happy. I don't care about the rest. Perhaps she meant it. Perhaps the rest, the men before her. The therapy, the internal struggle genuinely didn't matter because what they'd built together was real, regardless. Or perhaps she was performing her own role, the devoted widow, protecting her husband's reputation even after death. The tragedy compounded. On the 11th of September 2001, Barry Berenson boarded American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles. The plane was hijacked, flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. She died in the attack, becoming one of the nearly 3,000 victims. The Perkins family, already marked by Anthony's struggle and death, was struck again by random, catastrophic violence. What remains is the impossible question Anthony Perkins asked through his entire life. Can you change who you are? Can therapy redirect desire? Can performance become reality if you maintain it long enough? He tried to answer yes, underwent treatment, married, had children, built a life that suggested transformation was possible. But the HIV diagnosis suggests otherwise, that somewhere, somehow, Perkins continued having sex with men even after marriage, even after therapy, even after supposedly changing. Or perhaps he contracted it before Berenson, carried it silently through years of marriage, another secret in a life full of them. The truth died with him, and maybe that's appropriate. Maybe Anthony Perkins deserves to keep one thing private after spending his entire life trying to make his private self acceptable to a world that demanded he be someone else. Norman Bates was typecasting not because Perkins was a killer, but because he understood what it meant to be trapped by expectations, to perform a version of yourself that slowly consumes the original, to lose track of where the act ends and the person begins. He played Norman Bates brilliantly because he lived a version of that split every day, the public man and the private truth, the performed heterosexuality and the complicated reality, the therapy-approved version and whoever he actually was underneath. The mama's boy who couldn't establish independence turned out to be a man who couldn't establish certainty about his own identity. And perhaps that's the realest thing about Anthony Perkins, not that he was gay or straight or bisexual, but that he never got to simply be, that he spent his entire life trying to become someone acceptable, instead of accepting who he already was. Cesar Julio Romero Jr. was born in New York City on the 15th of February 1907 to Cuban parents who had fled political upheaval. His family had money once, lost it, rebuilt portions of it through determination and connections. Cesar grew up bilingual, bicultural, handsome in ways that Hollywood would eventually categorize as Latin, dark hair, expressive eyes, the kind of looks that could play romantic or dangerous depending on lighting and context. He started in vaudeville, then Broadway, dancing and performing before the Depression made everyone scramble for work. Hollywood noticed him in the early 1930 seconds, brought him west to play the roles they always gave to Latin actors, gigolos, lovers, gangsters, anyone whose ethnicity could add exotic flavor to American stories. Romero took the roles, made them work, established himself as reliable and professional. He could dance, he could act, he could charm audiences without threatening them too much. The Latin lover became his brand. He played opposite Shirley Temple, Marlene Dietrich, Carmen Miranda. He was handsome enough to be romantic, safe enough to not cause actual scandal. Studios photographed him with starlets, manufactured dates, created the impression of a man who loved women and was loved by them in return. The confirmed bachelor who nevertheless always had a beautiful woman on his arm at premieres and parties. He never married. Over 7 decades in show business, through hundreds of films and television appearances, Cesar Romero never once took a wife. The question came up constantly in interviews. Fan magazines asked it. Gossip columnists speculated. His answer remained consistent. Why would I marry and make one woman miserable when I can stay single and make them all happy? The line got laughs, deflected further inquiry, positioned him as a playboy rather than someone avoiding marriage for other reasons. His closest friendships were with other men in Hollywood's Latino community. Desi Arnaz knew him well, trusted him, brought him around his family. They understood each other in ways that went beyond shared language, both Cuban, both navigating an industry that wanted their ethnicity when convenient and ignored it otherwise. Arnaz never discussed what he knew about Romero's private life. The silence was protection, the kind of loyalty that required saying nothing rather than something. The mustache became legendary. Thick, perfectly groomed, it became part of his identity, the way other actors had signature hairstyles or voices. When he was cast as the Joker in the 1960 Seconds Batman television series, he refused to shave it. The makeup department covered it with white grease paint rather than force the issue. The result was a Joker with a visible mustache beneath the white skin. Absurd, and somehow perfect for the camp aesthetic of the show. Batman made Romero famous to a new generation. Children who had never seen his films from the 1930 Seconds and 40 Seconds knew him as the Joker, cackling and plotting elaborate crimes. The role paid well, kept him working, gave him visibility that sustained his career into his 60s and beyond. He leaned into the camp, understood that television in the 1960 Seconds was moving toward irony and self-awareness. The Joker was ridiculous, and Romero played him as exactly that, never pretending the material was serious. His Catholic faith remained central throughout his life. He attended Mass regularly, maintained connections to the church, participated in Catholic charitable work. The contradiction apparently never troubled him publicly, being a devout Catholic, while living a life that Catholic doctrine condemned. Perhaps he compartmentalized. Perhaps he found a way to reconcile faith and desire that satisfied him, even if it wouldn't satisfy church authorities. Perhaps he simply kept his private life so thoroughly private that even God couldn't verify the rumors. The confirmed bachelor lifestyle gave him freedom that married actors didn't have. He traveled extensively, maintained homes in different cities, lived according to his own schedule. He had friends, connections, relationships that remained undefined. The Hollywood community that knew the truth protected him because he'd never caused scandal, never been reckless, never forced anyone to acknowledge what they'd all agreed to ignore. He worked steadily into his 80s, character roles, television guest appearances, the occasional film. His face aged but remained recognizable, the mustache turning white, but never disappearing. He played priests, judges, authority figures, men of dignity and experience. The irony of Cesar Romero playing priests on television while being gay would have been lost on most viewers, but not on Romero himself. Everything was performance. Everything was costume. And some truths were simply more carefully guarded than others. He died on the 1st of January 1994 at St. John's Health Center in Santa Monica. He was 86 years old, having outlived most of his generation. The obituaries listed his career highlights, mentioned his never marrying, quoted his famous line about making women happy. None of them stated directly what many in Hollywood knew. The silence extended beyond death because Romero had never broken it in life, and there seemed no point in violating that choice after he couldn't defend himself. What remains is the architecture of the cover story, perfectly constructed, maintained for 7 decades, never failing because Romero never gave it the chance to fail. The beautiful women on his arm, the charm, the professional reliability, the careful balance between visibility and privacy. He showed up, did the work, went home to whatever life he'd built for himself, and never let the cameras follow. The loneliness of that choice is impossible to measure from outside. Did Cesar Romero spend 86 years wishing he could be honest? Or did the cover story become comfortable, familiar, the price he paid for career longevity and personal privacy? Did he have love in his life, relationships that sustained him, or was he genuinely alone behind the mustache and the charm? His friends knew but didn't tell. His church knew but looked away. Hollywood knew and profited from the illusion. And Cesar Romero himself, the man behind the Latin lover, behind the Joker's makeup, behind the confirmed bachelor status, took whatever truths he had to St. John's Hospital and then beyond, keeping his secrets perfectly maintained until the very end. The perfect cover story works because it gives people what they want to believe. Romero gave them the perpetual bachelor, the man too charming to settle down, the lover of women who somehow never found the one woman worthy of marriage. They bought it because buying it was easier than asking questions. And Romero maintained it because maintaining it was easier than facing what honesty would cost. He made them all happy, just like he promised, except possibly himself. But that part was never up for public discussion, and it isn't starting now. The silence he chose in life extends beyond it. And perhaps that's exactly what Cesar Romero wanted to be remembered for, the roles he played, rather than the role he lived. She was born Ruby Catherine Stevens on the 16th of July, 1907, in Brooklyn, New York. Her mother died when Ruby was 4, kicked by a drunk passenger off a streetcar. Her father vanished afterward, unable or unwilling to care for 5 children alone. Ruby was raised by older siblings, passed between families, essentially orphaned by circumstance rather than death. She learned early that survival meant self-reliance, that nobody was coming to save her, that softness was a luxury she couldn't afford. At 13, she dropped out of school and started working. Department stores, telephone companies, anything that paid. At 15, she found her way into show business, first as a dancer, then a Ziegfeld girl, eventually onto Broadway. She changed her name to Barbara Stanwyck, a construction that sounded simultaneously tough and glamorous. Ruby Stevens from Brooklyn tenements became Barbara Stanwyck, the actress through sheer determination and talent nobody could deny. Hollywood noticed her in the late 1920 seconds. Frank Capra cast her in Ladies of Leisure in 1930, and the camera revealed something remarkable. Stanwyck didn't perform femininity the way other actresses did. She moved differently, spoke differently, held herself with a directness that read as masculine in an era when women were supposed to be soft and yielding. Audiences responded. Here was a woman who could be tough, could play working-class characters without condescension, could look men in the eye as equals. Her first marriage was to Frank Fay, a vaudeville comedian and actor who was charming on stage and abusive off it. The marriage lasted from 1928 to 1935. 7 years of escalating violence that Stanwyck rarely discussed publicly. Fay hit her, controlled her money, resented her growing success. The divorce was bitter. They'd adopted a son, Dion, whom Stanwyck struggled to mother. She was too tough, too self-sufficient, unable to access the maternal softness that 1,930 seconds America expected. Dion later said she was distant, unable to show affection, more comfortable on film sets than in homes. Her second marriage was to Robert Taylor in 1939. Taylor was beautiful, one of MGM's biggest stars, dark-haired and handsome in ways that made women swoon. The marriage was covered extensively by fan magazines, positioned as the ultimate Hollywood romance. But Taylor himself was rumored to be gay, and the marriage functioned more as mutual protection than passionate love. They stayed married until 1951, 12 years of maintaining appearances while living increasingly separate lives. The rumors about Stanwyck started early. She didn't date much after the Taylor divorce. She lived alone, focused on work, surrounded herself with a few close female friends. In Hollywood, that pattern was recognizable. When you knew how to read the signs, Stanwyck was obvious. Joan Crawford was the name most frequently whispered. Crawford herself was bisexual, had affairs with men and women throughout her career, navigated Hollywood's closet with the skill of someone who understood power dynamics instinctively. She and Stanwyck were close for years, spent time together privately, shared something that went beyond friendship. The exact nature remains speculation. Both women are dead. Neither confirmed anything publicly. But the rumors persisted because they came from people who were there, who saw what others missed. Stanwyck's on-screen persona reinforced the speculation. She played tough women, independent women, women who didn't need men, except when they chose to. In Double Indemnity, she was the femme fatale who manipulated men rather than being manipulated by them. In The Lady Eve, she was the con artist smarter than her mark. In 40 Guns, she was a cattle baroness who controlled men through force of will. She wore pants in films when other actresses wore dresses. She moved through scenes with a swagger that belonged to men but somehow worked for her. "I was never girly-girly," she said once. "I was one of the boys." The statement could mean anything or nothing. She came from Brooklyn, survived poverty and abuse, learned to be tough because softness meant vulnerability. But in Hollywood, where every word was analyzed for subtext, the phrase carried weight. One of the boys meant something specific when applied to a woman who'd never been convincingly paired with a man off screen. Her career lasted into the 1,980 seconds. She transitioned from film to television, played the matriarch in The Big Valley, won Emmys for playing strong women who ran things. She never softened, never became the warm grandmother figure that aging actresses were supposed to become. She remained Barbara Stanwyck, tough, direct, professional, asking no favors and giving none. She lived alone in her later years. Dion, the son she'd adopted and struggled to love, was estranged. She had acquaintances, but few close friends. The loneliness of her final years was apparent to people who knew her. She'd survived poverty, abuse, 2 marriages, decades, in an industry that chewed people up and spit them out. She'd built a career through talent and determination, but she'd done it alone, without the softness or vulnerability that might have made connection possible. She died on the 20th of January 1990 at St. John's Health Center in Santa Monica. She was 82 years old. The obituaries praised her career: 4 Oscar nominations, 3 Emmy wins, a Lifetime Achievement Award. They mentioned her tough woman roles, her Brooklyn origins, her professional reputation. They listed her marriages, her son, the men she'd worked with. They didn't mention Joan Crawford, except in passing. They didn't discuss the rumors, the speculation, the possibility that Barbara Stanwyck had loved women in an era when loving women meant hiding it so thoroughly that even historians couldn't be certain. What remains is absence: no love letters saved, no diary entries, no deathbed confessions. If Stanwyck loved women, she took that truth to St. John's Hospital and beyond, protecting it the way she protected herself her entire life. The erasure of women's desire in history happens precisely this way, through silence, through destruction of evidence, through the decision that some truths aren't worth recording. Ruby Stevens from Brooklyn knew about survival, knew about keeping secrets, knew about showing the world only what it needed to see. Barbara Stanwyck, the construction she built, maintained that discipline for 70 years. Tough, professional, independent, giving brilliant performances while keeping everything real locked away where cameras couldn't reach. The men in her life were documented: 2 husbands, countless male co-stars, directors who praised her professionalism. The women remained whispers, speculation, rumors that couldn't be confirmed because the evidence was never preserved. Joan Crawford died in 1977, taking whatever she knew to her grave. Stanwyck followed 13 years later, equally silent. In 100 years, when historians discuss classic Hollywood, they'll mention Barbara Stanwyck's career, her tough woman roles, her incredible talent. Some will note the rumors, the speculation, the possibility, but without confirmation, without evidence, without Stanwyck herself stating clearly what Ruby Stevens from Brooklyn knew to be true. History records only uncertainty. And perhaps that's the greatest tragedy: not that Barbara Stanwyck had to hide, but that she hid so successfully that even now, decades after her death, we can't be certain what we lost. The performances remain, brilliant and tough and independent. But the woman behind them, the one who loved who she loved and never said it aloud, disappears into silence that stretches from 1907 to 1990 and beyond, protecting secrets that nobody will ever be able to confirm. His real name was Arthur Andrew Gellian, and he looked like America wanted to look: blonde, blue-eyed, square-jawed, the kind of handsome that seemed healthy rather than threatening. He was born in New York City in 1931, raised in California after his parents divorced. As a teenager, he worked as a stable boy, riding horses for wealthy people who could afford to keep them. Someone saw him at an ice skating rink in 1948, thought he had the look studios wanted, and introduced him to an agent. The agent was Henry Wilson, the same man who would later discover Rock Hudson and rename him for stardom. Wilson specialized in handsome young men, manufactured their images, created their careers. He looked at Arthur Gellian and saw raw material. The face was perfect, the body athletic, the personality malleable. He renamed him Tab Hunter. The first name came from Wilson's aunt's description of Arthur as a tab of dynamite. The last name was obvious: the all-American boy who hunted, fished, embodied outdoor masculinity. Warner Brothers signed him in 1952. The publicity machine started immediately. Carefully orchestrated dates with starlets. Natalie Wood was photographed with him, constantly young, beautiful, both of them blonde and wholesome. The studio positioned them as America's teenage sweethearts, the couple parents wanted their children to become. Every photo was manufactured, every date arranged, every smile practiced. Wood, later said they were friends. Nothing more. She understood the game because she was playing it too. What Warner Brothers didn't publicize was the arrest in 1950, before Tab Hunter became Tab Hunter. Arthur Gellian had been at a party in Los Angeles that was raided by police. The party was attended by gay men. The arrest was for disorderly conduct. Nothing serious legally, but potentially catastrophic for an aspiring actor. The studio hushed it up, paid people to keep quiet, ensured the arrest records stayed buried. But the information existed, which meant it could be weaponized. That's where Confidential magazine entered the story. Confidential was the scandal magazine of the 1,950 seconds, publishing stories that mainstream media wouldn't touch: affairs, addictions, arrests, homosexuality. They had sources everywhere, bought information from police departments, paid housekeepers and assistants for gossip. They knew about Tab Hunter's arrest. They could destroy him with a single story. The studios made a deal. They always made deals with Confidential. You want a story? Here's a bigger one about someone we're willing to sacrifice. You leave our star alone, we give you someone else. The bargains were made constantly, deciding whose career could be destroyed to protect someone more valuable. Tab Hunter was protected because Warner Brothers needed his image intact. Someone else, an actress past her prime, an actor who'd angered the studio, would be fed to Confidential instead. But Hunter knew the truth. His career existed at the pleasure of forces beyond his control. His image was manufactured, his dates arranged, his privacy non-existent. And beneath it all was the reality of who he actually was and who he actually loved. He met Anthony Perkins in the mid-1,950 seconds. Perkins was sensitive, intense, the opposite of Tab Hunter's all-American persona. They began a relationship that lasted several years, conducted entirely in private. They understood each other's situation, the impossible balance between public image and private truth. They couldn't be seen together except as casual friends. They couldn't acknowledge what they were to each other. They had to hide the relationship even from people who suspected, maintaining the fiction even when it became exhausting. The relationship ended badly, as relationships conducted in complete secrecy often do. Perkins pursued conversion therapy, trying to change himself. Hunter continued navigating Hollywood's closet, dating women publicly while living differently privately. He had a relationship with figure skater Ronnie Robertson that lasted years, another love affair conducted entirely in shadows. His career peaked in the late 1,950 seconds. Damn Yankees made him a star, playing the baseball player who sells his soul to win. The film was successful. Hunter was charming, and for a brief moment it seemed like he might become a major star rather than just a teen idol. But teen idol proved to be his ceiling. As he aged past the all-American boy, roles dried up. By the 1,960 seconds, he was doing television guest spots and B-movies. The decline gradual, but inevitable. He shifted to Europe in the 1,960 seconds, making Italian films where his fading American stardom still had currency. The work was steady if not prestigious. He could live more freely in Europe, where American expectations didn't follow quite as heavily. But he always came back to California, drawn by the industry that had made him and the closet he couldn't quite leave. The 1,970 seconds and 80 seconds were quiet decades. Television work, small roles, periods of retirement. He produced films occasionally, stayed connected to the industry without being central to it. He met Alan Glazer, a film producer, and they began a relationship that would last the rest of his life. But it remained private, unacknowledged publicly. Another secret in a life built on secrets. The world changed while Tab Hunter aged. Stonewall happened in 1969. Gay liberation movements grew through the 1,970 seconds. By the 1,980 seconds, some actors were coming out, though still not many. Rock Hudson's death in 1985 forced conversations Hollywood had avoided, but Hunter stayed silent, protecting the image even as the image became increasingly irrelevant. Finally, in 2005, at age 74, Tab Hunter published a memoir. Tab Hunter Confidential told his story, confirmed what many had suspected, acknowledged the relationships he'd hidden for 50 years. Anthony Perkins was mentioned, the love that couldn't survive the pressure, the manufactured dates, the studio protection, the deals made to keep Confidential quiet, all of it laid out plainly, decades after it mattered to his career. The relief in the book is palpable. Hunter had carried the secret for so long that revealing it felt like exhaling after holding his breath for half a century. Reviews were positive, sympathetic. The documentary adaptation in 2015 introduced him to a new generation who knew nothing about 1,950 seconds teen idols, but understood the cost of hiding. Tab Hunter died on the 8th of July 2018 in Santa Barbara, California. He was 86 years old. Alan Glazer was by his side, the partner who'd been with him for decades and could finally be acknowledged. The obituaries mentioned the relationship openly, something that would have been impossible in 1955, when Tab Hunter was the biggest teen idol in America. He lived long enough to see the world change, long enough to tell his truth, long enough to stop hiding. That makes him one of the fortunate ones. Anthony Perkins died, still closeted. Rock Hudson was outed by disease. Montgomery Clift never survived long enough to make the choice. But Tab Hunter, the blonde all-American boy who looked exactly like what 1,950 seconds America wanted, got to become an old man who could finally be honest. The question isn't whether the honesty came too late. The question is what those 74 years of hiding cost him, the relationships that couldn't be acknowledged, the love letters that couldn't be kept, the public life that bore no resemblance to the private one. He paid that price for career longevity and safety. And then, when age made him invisible anyway, he spoke and discovered that the world had changed enough that speaking wouldn't destroy him after all. Raymond William Stacey Burr was born in New Westminster, British Columbia, on the 21st of May, 1917. He was large even as a child, grew to over 6 feet and 200 pounds, the kind of physical presence that dominated rooms. His early career was in radio, then small film roles in the 1,940 seconds, where his size and deep voice made him perfect for villains. He played heavies in film noir, menacing figures who lurked in shadows and threatened protagonists. In Rear Window, Hitchcock cast him as the murderer, precisely because his bulk made him frightening. But villain roles have limited shelf life. By the mid-1,950 seconds, Burr needed something different, something that would give him steady work and transform his image. Television provided the answer. In 1957, CBS cast him as Perry Mason, the defense attorney in early Stanley Gardner's Legal Mysteries. The role required authority, intelligence, absolute moral certainty. Burr had all of it. For 9 years, from 1,957 to 1,966, he played Perry Mason in 271 episodes, never losing a case, always finding the truth, embodying justice with such conviction that audiences forgot he'd ever been anything else. The show made Burr wealthy and famous. Perry Mason became one of television's most popular programs, the template for every legal drama that followed. Burr won 2 Emmy Awards, became so identified with the character that for the rest of his life people called him Perry. He'd achieved what every actor wants, a role so perfect it erases everything that came before. But Perry Mason's personal life was non-existent. The character had no wife, no girlfriend, no romantic entanglements. He lived for his work, for justice, for the law, and Raymond Burr, playing him, claimed a personal life that mirrored that dedication, a tragic past that explained his solitary present. The story Burr told was heartbreaking. He'd been married 3 times. His first wife, Annette Sutherland, died in a plane crash in 1943. His second wife, Laura Andrina Morgan, died of cancer. His son, Michael Evan Burr, from one of these marriages, died of leukemia at age 10. These losses explained why Burr remained unmarried, why he seemed haunted, why he threw himself into work with such intensity. Tragedy justified his solitude. The problem was that none of it was true. There was no Annette Sutherland, no Laura Andrina Morgan, no Michael Evan Burr, no plane crash, no cancer, no leukemia. Burr had invented a tragic past so complete, so detailed, so consistently maintained that for decades nobody questioned it. He provided names, dates, circumstances. He spoke about his dead son with such apparent grief that interviewers felt guilty pressing for details. The tragedy was protection. Who would investigate a man who'd lost so much? The truth was simpler, and in 1,950 seconds and 60 seconds America, more dangerous, Raymond Burr was gay, and he'd found a man he wanted to spend his life with. Robert Benavides met Burr in 1957, the same year Perry Mason premiered. Benavides was younger, in his 20s, working in the industry. They began a relationship that would last until Burr's death, 35 years together, building a life that couldn't be acknowledged publicly. Benavides became Burr's business partner, the cover story that explained his constant presence. They bought property together, traveled together, lived together. To anyone paying attention, the relationship was obvious, but nobody was supposed to pay attention. They created an orchid business together. Burr loved orchids, became an expert on their cultivation, eventually owned orchid farms in Fiji and California. It was a legitimate business interest, but it also provided cover. Benavides was his business partner in the orchid trade, nothing more. The explanation satisfied journalists who didn't want to ask harder questions. Perry Mason ended in 1966 after 9 seasons. Burr immediately transitioned to another series, Ironside, playing a wheelchair-bound detective. The show ran from 1967 to 1975, another 8 years of steady work and continued fame. Then came Perry Mason television movies in the 1980 seconds and early 90 seconds, bringing the character back for a new generation. Burr worked steadily, remained visible, maintained the image of the dedicated bachelor whose tragic past explained his solitary present. Through it all, Benavides was there. Not in publicity photos, not in interviews, not acknowledged in any official capacity, but there managing the business, sharing the homes, living the life that couldn't be discussed. The orchid farms in Fiji became their retreat, a place where they could exist together without constantly maintaining the fiction. But even in Fiji, among people who knew them, the relationship remained undefined, unacknowledged, protected by silence. Burr developed kidney cancer in the early 1990 seconds. He continued working through treatment, filming Perry Mason movies even as his health declined. The illness was private initially, then impossible to hide. On the 12th of September, 1993, at his ranch near Healdsburg, California, Raymond Burr died. He was 76 years old. Robert Benavides was with him at the end. They'd spent 35 years together, longer than most marriages, longer than many friendships, an entire adult lifetime shared. But the obituaries didn't mention Benavides except as a business associate. if they mentioned him at all. The invented wives received more space than the man who'd actually been there for 3.5 decades. The tragic past, the dead son, the plane crash, all the fiction received acknowledgement while the truth was erased. Benavides later discussed the relationship, confirming what many had suspected. He talked about their life together, the orchid farms, the years of companionship. He seemed neither angry nor particularly sad about the erasure. This was simply how it had been. The price of loving Raymond Burr, in an era when loving Raymond Burr meant accepting invisibility. The elaborate fiction Burr constructed protected the simple truth. He loved a man and wanted to build a life with him. Rather than face career destruction, he invented dead wives and a dead child, created a tragic backstory so compelling that investigating it felt cruel. The lie was merciful compared to the truth. The truth would have ended Perry Mason before it started, killed Ironside, destroyed the career that gave Burr wealth and stability, and the means to build the orchid farms where he and Benavides could finally be themselves. The question that remains is whether the fiction was worth it. 35 years with Benavides, hidden but real. A career spanning 5 decades, successful and respected. Financial security that allowed them to create something beautiful with the orchids. All of it purchased with an elaborate lie about dead women and a dead child who never existed. Perry Mason never lied. Perry Mason always found the truth, always revealed it in court, always ensured justice prevailed. But Raymond Burr, playing Perry Mason, lied constantly, maintained fiction as thoroughly as his character pursued truth. The irony seems almost too perfect. The man who embodied justice on screen built his life on deception, and the deception worked so well that even now, decades after his death, people remember the fake tragedies better than the real love that actually sustained him. Charles Laughton was born in Scarborough, England, in 1899, the son of hotel owners who expected him to join the family business. Instead, he discovered acting, attended the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, found in performance a way to channel the intensity that made him uncomfortable in ordinary life. He was heavy, not conventionally handsome, with a face that seemed to contain multitudes capable of rage, tenderness, grotesquerie, nobility. Directors saw it immediately. Here was an actor who could transform into anything. Elsa Lanchester was also English, born in 1902, raised in an unconventional household by socialist parents who rejected traditional marriage. She became a performer, dancer, and actress, attracted to the avant-garde and experimental. She was small, red-haired, sharp-featured, with a wit that could cut through pretension. When she met Charles Laughton in the 1922 London theatre scene, they recognized something in each other. Not romantic love in the conventional sense, but understanding. Laughton was gay. This wasn't speculation or rumor, he knew it. Struggled with it. Carried Catholic shame about it that would burden him for life. In 1922, England, homosexuality was criminal. Oscar Wilde's imprisonment in the 1890 seconds remained a cautionary tale. Laughton understood that survival meant hiding, that acting wasn't just his profession but his necessary mode of existence. Lanchester understood. When they married in 1929, it was with clear eyes and honest conversation. They made an arrangement. Legal marriage for social protection, personal freedom for both of them. She would have her affairs, he would have his, and they would build something together that transcended conventional definitions. The marriage was unconventional, but it was also real, a partnership based on respect and genuine affection, even without sexual desire. They came to Hollywood in the early 1930 seconds. Laughton first for the old dark house, then both of them for good. Hollywood made Laughton a star. He played Henry VIII in The Private Life of Henry VIII. won the Academy Award, became one of the most respected actors in the industry. He was Captain Bligh in Mutiny on the Bounty, Quasimodo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, characters of complexity and darkness that other actors couldn't access. His homosexuality became an open secret in Hollywood. People knew but didn't say. Protected by the understanding that Laughton's talent made him valuable, Lanchester built her own career. Smaller, but significant. She played character roles, was nominated for an Oscar for Come to the Stable, became famous as the Bride of Frankenstein with her shock of white streaked hair standing on end. She appeared in many of Laughton's films, their professional partnership as solid as their personal arrangement. But the arrangement had costs. Laughton's Catholic guilt never left him. He believed his homosexuality was sinful, believed he was fundamentally broken, carried shame that manifested in depression and self-loathing. He would disappear for days, cruise for men in dangerous situations, return home devastated by his own behavior. Lanchester watched this cycle repeat, offered what comfort she could, but couldn't fix what was broken in him. His attractions ran toward younger men, often working class, often rough. The encounters were risky. Blackmail was common, violence possible. Several times he was threatened, had to pay money to avoid exposure. The studio helped when necessary, made problems disappear, ensured Laughton could continue working. But each incident reinforced his shame, his sense that he was doing something terrible even as he couldn't stop doing it. Lanchester had her own affairs, more openly acknowledged. She was linked with several men over the years, conducted relationships with less fear because heterosexual affairs didn't carry the same legal and social danger. But she always came back to Laughton, to their home, to the partnership they'd built. Whatever freedom she took, she didn't abandon him. They lived in a house in Hollywood Hills, created a life that worked for them, even if it wouldn't work for others. They had friends, hosted gatherings, participated in the social life that Hollywood required. To outsiders, they seemed like a slightly eccentric couple, but nothing shocking. The truth was hidden in plain sight. Two people who loved each other without being in love with each other, who'd chosen honesty between themselves even while maintaining fiction for the world. Laughton's later career included teaching, directing, and a famous one-man show where he read from literature. He was particularly moving reading the Bible. Despite his conflicted relationship with Catholic faith, he could make scripture sound new, could find humanity in ancient texts, could move audiences to tears with nothing but his voice and presence. The performances were in some way confessional, this man struggling with guilt and self-hatred, finding in literature a way to express what he couldn't say directly. He developed cancer in the early 1960 seconds. The illness was brutal, painful, diminishing. Lanchester cared for him through it, the decades of their arrangement culminating in this final act of devotion. Whatever freedom they'd given each other, whatever affairs and complications, in the end she was there, fulfilling the vows they'd made in 1,929 inches, their own particular way. Charles Laughton died on the 15th of December, 1962, at age 63. Lanchester was with him. The obituaries mentioned their marriage, his career, his brilliance. They didn't mention his homosexuality, his struggles, the shame that had tormented him. He died as Charles Laughton, respected actor, beloved husband, his private anguish remaining private. Lanchester lived another 24 years. She wrote a memoir, Elsa, Lanchester herself, published in 1983. The book told just enough confirmed Laughton was gay, discussed their arrangement, revealed the marriage was unconventional, but she told it with love, made clear that whatever they'd been to each other was real, even if it didn't fit standard definitions. We gave each other freedom, which is the greatest gift, she wrote. She meant it. She died in 1986, 84 years old, having outlived Laughton by nearly a quarter century. They're buried together. The partnership that began in 1929, acknowledged finally as something Hollywood couldn't fully categorize, but couldn't deny. What remains is the question of whether their marriage was sad or triumphant. Sad because it required hiding, because Laughton's shame never lifted, because the freedom they gave each other came from necessity rather than choice. Triumphant because they made it work, built something genuine in impossible circumstances, stayed together when easier paths existed. The marriages that worked in Hollywood were often the ones that weren't traditional. When you removed conventional expectations, sexual fidelity, romantic love, prescribed gender roles, what remained could be stronger because it was chosen rather than assumed. Laughton and Lanchester chose each other repeatedly for 33 years. They witnessed each other's affairs, supported each other's careers, created a home where both could be themselves. The arrangement was honest in ways that conventional marriages often weren't. Perhaps that's the real story. Not that Charles Laughton was gay and married a woman, but that Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester built something genuine by being honest about what they actually needed, rather than pretending to want what society expected. The freedom they gave each other was indeed the greatest gift, purchased with courage and maintained with love that didn't require desire to be real. George Dewey Cukor was born in New York City in 1899 into a family of Hungarian Jewish immigrants who'd built comfortable lives in America. He discovered theater as a young man, worked his way up from stage manager to director, understood that theater required precision and attention to actors in ways that other directors missed. When Hollywood transitioned to sound in the late 1920 seconds and desperately needed people who understood dialogue, Cukor migrated west. His gift was working with actresses. He could draw performances from women that other directors couldn't access, understood something essential about feminine psychology that let him coax nuance and depth from even the most glamorous stars. Greta Garbo trusted him. Katharine Hepburn flourished under his direction. Joan Crawford, Norma Shearer, Jean Harlow, the biggest names in Hollywood, sought him out because he made them better than they knew they could be. The women's director became his nickname. It sounded like a compliment, and sometimes it was. But in Hollywood's masculinity-obsessed culture, it also carried an edge, a suggestion that Cukor was somehow less than fully male, that his understanding of women came from being insufficiently masculine himself. The code was obvious to anyone who understood how Hollywood talked around things it couldn't say directly. George Cukor was gay, and everyone knew it, and calling him the women's director was a way of acknowledging it without actually acknowledging it. The defining moment of his career came in 1939 with Gone with the Wind. David O. Selznick hired him to direct, recognizing that the film required someone who could handle Vivien Leigh's Scarlett O'Hara with sensitivity. Cukor began filming, worked with the actors, started shaping the massive production. Then, 3 weeks in, he was fired. The official reason was creative differences. The real reason was Clark Gable. Gable didn't want to work with Cukor, made his discomfort clear to Selznick, essentially gave an ultimatum: Cukor goes or I go. Gable's objection was rooted in homophobia. He didn't want a gay director, felt uncomfortable, refused to continue. Selznick chose his male star over his director, and Victor Fleming took over Gone with the Wind. The loss was devastating. Gone with the Wind became the most successful film of all time, won 10 Academy Awards, defined Hollywood's golden age. Cukor should have been the director of record, should have won the Oscar, should have been celebrated. Instead, he was erased from the project. that became legendary. And he couldn't even complain publicly because complaining would require explaining why Gable objected, which would require acknowledging what everyone knew but nobody said. Cukor kept working. He directed the Philadelphia Story with Katharine Hepburn and Cary Grant, Gaslight, starring Ingrid Bergman, Adam's Rib with Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. A Star is Born with Judy Garland. Film after film showcasing actresses at their absolute best, giving them material that respected their intelligence and showcased their talent. His home in Hollywood Hills became famous for Sunday gatherings where gay Hollywood could relax, be themselves, feel safe. The pool parties were legendary actors, writers, designers. All the people who lived double lives could come to Cukor's and drop the pretense. He was godfather to the community in ways that went beyond hosting parties. When Montgomery Clift was struggling, Cukor gave him work, protected him. When James Dean was starting out, Cukor mentored him, saw the talent before Hollywood did. Katharine Hepburn remained his closest friend for decades. Their partnership built on mutual respect and understanding that transcended the usual director-actress relationship. Cukor never publicly came out because he never publicly went in. His homosexuality was simply known, discussed in the industry, understood by everyone who mattered. He never married, never pretended to date women. His status as a successful director gave him protection. He was too valuable, too talented, too connected to be destroyed for something everyone already knew. But the price was paid in other ways. He never won an Academy Award despite being nominated 5 times over 3 decades. The industry respected him, worked with him, gave him the best projects. But the top prize eluded him repeatedly, as if some invisible barrier prevented full acknowledgement of his genius. Was it his homosexuality? His firing from Gone with the Wind creating lasting resentment? His association with actresses making him seem less serious than directors who worked primarily with men? Perhaps all of it. None of it fully provable, but the pattern undeniable. Finally, in 1964, Cukor won the Oscar for My Fair Lady. He was 65 years old, having directed films for 35 years. Audrey Hepburn as Eliza Doolittle, Rex Harrison as Henry Higgins, a lavish production that swept the awards. When Cukor's name was announced, the audience stood and applauded. Recognition finally arrived, decades late, but still meaningful. He gave a gracious speech, thanked the cast and crew, acted as if this was expected rather than overdue. He continued working into his 80s. His last film was Rich and Famous in 1981, starring Jacqueline Bisset and Candice Bergen, another story about women's lives and friendships. Even at 82, Cukor was still the women's director, still understanding something about feminine experience that other directors missed. George Cukor died on the 24th of January 1983 at his home in Los Angeles. He was 83 years old, having lived through silent films, talkies, color, television, the complete transformation of Hollywood. He died wealthy, successful, respected, his homosexuality acknowledged, but never having been his defining characteristic. The obituaries praised his films, his work with actresses, his contribution to cinema. Some mentioned he never married. Most didn't discuss why. What remains is the body of work, 45 films over 5 decades, many of them featuring the best performances by the best actresses of their generation. Greta Garbo's most nuanced work was with Cukor. Katharine Hepburn's most complex roles came under his direction. Judy Garland's most emotionally raw performance was in A Star is Born, directed by Cukor. He gave actresses what they rarely got in Hollywood: respect, intelligence, characters who were complicated and human rather than just beautiful. The nickname the women's director, was meant as a diminishment, a way of suggesting Cukor was less than other directors. But he transformed it into legacy, proved that understanding women, respecting women, showcasing women's talent was actually the mark of greatness rather than weakness. He created space where actresses could do their best work, and in doing so, he created some of the finest films in Hollywood history. The man who was fired from Gone with the Wind because of who he loved became the director who elevated an entire generation of actresses, created art that endures, proved that talent ultimately matters more than prejudice. Clark Gable won his battle in 1939 but lost the war. Cukor's films remain. His influence persists, and the pool parties in the Hollywood Hills, where gay men could finally be themselves, have become part of the mythology of an era. The women's director understood something essential, that being himself, even when himself was unacceptable, ultimately produced better art than any amount of hiding ever could. Some secrets were kept perfectly. Some leaked slowly over decades. Some were confirmed only after death, when revelation could no longer hurt. This is the chapter of whispers, of those whose stories don't fill entire chapters, but whose hiding shaped Hollywood just as profoundly. Greta Garbo wanted to be alone. The phrase became her trademark, the explanation for everything mysterious about her. Why did she retire at 36, at the peak of her beauty and fame? Why did she never marry despite being the most desirable woman in the world? Why did she spend her later decades walking the streets of New York in sunglasses, avoiding cameras, maintaining absolute privacy? The answer was always, I want to be alone. But alone meant something specific. She spent years with Mercedes de Acosta, the writer and socialite who collected famous women the way others collected art. De Acosta wrote love letters to Garbo that were explicit in their longing. She wrote in her memoir about their relationship, disguised barely enough to avoid lawsuits. Garbo never confirmed, never denied, simply withdrew further from public life. When she died in 1990 at 84, her sexuality remained officially uncertain. The evidence, circumstantial but compelling. Alone meant without men. It didn't necessarily mean without anyone. Agnes Moorehead played Endora on Bewitched, the witch who disapproved of her daughter's marriage to a mortal. Television audiences in the 1,960 seconds loved her acid tongue, her theatrical entrances, her absolute certainty that she knew best. Before television, she'd been a serious actress. Citizen Kane, The Magnificent Ambersons, films that showcased her range. She was nominated for 4 Academy Awards without winning, a pattern that seemed designed to frustrate. She never married. Well, not never. She'd been married twice early in her career. Briefly, marriages that ended quickly and were rarely discussed. But for most of her adult life, from the 1,950 seconds until her death in 1974, Agnes Moorehead lived with Mildred Natwick, another actress. They were companions, roommates, friends who shared their lives so completely that separation seemed unthinkable. The rumors were constant, the denials equally consistent. Moorehead died of cancer at 63, Natwick at her side. Whatever they were to each other went unstated, protected by the language of friendship that could mean anything or everything. Clifton Webb was the eternal mama's boy. He lived with his mother, Mabel, for most of his life, first in their New York apartment, then in their Hollywood home. Mabel managed his career, controlled his social life, dominated his existence so thoroughly that when she died in 1960, Webb was devastated beyond recovery. He lived another 6 years, increasingly reclusive, dying in 1966 of a heart attack at 76. The mama's boy image was both cover story and reality. Yes, Mabel Webb controlled her son's life, but that control also protected him from questions about why he never married, never dated women, never showed interest in the romantic relationships that most men pursued. His homosexuality was an open secret in Hollywood, acknowledged by everyone who worked with him, but the mama's boy explanation satisfied the public. When Mabel died, Clifton lost his protector and his excuse simultaneously. Sal Mineo was the doomed teenager in Rebel Without a Cause, playing Plato with such obvious devotion to James Dean's character that speculation started immediately. Mineo's career continued through the 1,960 seconds, gradually diminishing as he aged out of teenage roles. He spoke publicly about his bisexuality in the early 1,970 seconds, one of the first actors to do so while still trying to maintain a career. The admission hurt him professionally but freed him personally. On the 12th of February 1976, Mineo was stabbed to death in the alley behind his West Hollywood apartment. He was 37 years old. The murder was initially assumed to be a hate crime, killed for being gay. Later evidence suggested it was a robbery gone wrong, a random act of violence by a man who didn't know his victim. But the initial assumption revealed how people thought about Sal Mineo, that being openly gay in 1,970 seconds, Hollywood meant being vulnerable, that honesty could get you killed. He was posthumously outed more completely than he'd outed himself. His private life, dissected in obituaries, the speculation endless. Tallulah Bankhead never pretended to be anything other than what she was. Darling, I've tried everything once, was more than a quip, it was philosophy. She had affairs with men, affairs with women, affairs that defied categorization. She drank, smoked, took lovers as she pleased, lived with theatrical excess that made quieter people exhausted. Her bisexuality was discussed openly because she discussed it openly, daring anyone to make an issue of it. The daring worked because Bankhead was wealthy, Southern aristocracy, connected to powerful families. She could afford to be outrageous because she had protection that working-class actors didn't. When she died in 1968, at 66, destroyed by decades of excess, the obituaries mentioned her wildness but treated her sexuality as part of her theatrical persona rather than something shameful. Class privilege bought her the freedom to be herself in ways that most actors never accessed. Judith Anderson was Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire, one of the most respected actresses of her generation. She played Mrs. Danvers in Rebecca, the sinister housekeeper whose devotion to her dead mistress suggested obsession that went beyond service. She worked consistently for 6 decades, commanded stages in Australia, England, and America, won every award theatre could offer. She married twice, briefly, early in her career. The marriages were over quickly, rarely mentioned afterward. She lived the rest of her 70-plus year career as a single woman devoted to her craft. The whispers about Anderson were constant but never confirmed. She maintained absolute privacy, never discussed personal matters in interviews, kept her life separate from her work, with discipline that was itself theatrical. When she died in 1992 at 94, having outlived most of her generation, the truth died with her. What remains is speculation, patterns that suggest something but prove nothing. Vincent Price was married 3 times, had children, seemed thoroughly heterosexual to audiences who knew him as the master of horror films. His rich voice, theatrical manner, and obvious delight in camp made him beloved. After his death in 1993, revelations emerged slowly. He'd had affairs with men, identified as bisexual, lived a more complicated life than his 3 marriages suggested. His daughter confirmed it. Other actors discussed it. The evidence accumulated. But Price himself never spoke about it publicly, maintaining the heterosexual image while privately living differently. These are the others, the ones whose stories exist in fragments, some confirmed, some suspected, some so thoroughly hidden that truth becomes impossible to separate from speculation. How many more remain completely unknown? How many actors successfully hid for entire careers, died with secrets intact, left no evidence for historians to discover? The number is probably larger than we can imagine. The silence, more complete than gaps in the record suggest. Each represents a choice to reveal or hide, to risk everything for honesty, or maintain safety through deception. Some had the wealth or status to be partially honest. Some had nothing but their careers and protected them at all costs. Some lived long enough to see the world change and chose revelation. Some died too soon, their truths dying with them. All of them navigated an industry built on images, where the gap between public and private could swallow entire lives, where the person on screen bore no necessary relationship to the person who returned home when filming ended. The litany of whispers continues because some voices never got loud enough to be heard clearly, because evidence was destroyed, because people who knew chose silence, because Hollywood's machinery of illusion worked so well that separating truth from performance became impossible. What remains is absence, the shape of secrets that can be sensed but never fully known. The studio system collapsed slowly. Then suddenly, by the late 1960 seconds, the power that Louis B. Mayer and his contemporaries wielded had dissipated. Studios still existed but no longer controlled every aspect of actors' lives. The morality clauses that dictated who could marry whom, that forced lavender marriages and manufactured romances, lost their teeth. Actors became free agents, negotiating their own contracts, controlling their own images. Freedom arrived gradually, unevenly, bringing new possibilities and revealing how much had been lost. The 28th of June, 1969, police raided the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village. It was routine harassment, the kind that happened regularly to gay bars in New York. But this time, the patrons fought back. The riots lasted days, sparked a movement that transformed how LGBTQ people thought about themselves and their place in society. Gay liberation was born in those riots, spreading across America, creating space for pride where previously only shame existed. Hollywood barely acknowledged Stonewall. The revolution happening in the streets didn't reach studio offices, didn't change how films were made or who could be openly gay in them. The actors who'd hidden for decades kept hiding. New actors learned the same lessons about discretion and cover stories. The machinery of the closet continued operating because the incentives remained unchanged. Being openly gay still meant career death, still meant losing roles, still meant being unmarketable to mainstream audiences. Then came the AIDS crisis. The first cases appeared in 1981. By 1982, the Centers for Disease Control had named it AIDS-Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. By 1983, thousands were dead. By 1984, the death toll was in the tens of thousands, and climbing. It killed primarily gay men, killed them publicly and horribly, turned healthy bodies into skeletal figures covered in lesions. The government did almost nothing. President Reagan didn't say the word AIDS publicly until 1985, when the death toll had already passed 10,000. Rock Hudson changed everything. When he announced his diagnosis in July 1985, AIDS stopped being something that happened to anonymous people. It had the face of America's romantic leading man, the person who'd embodied heterosexual desire for 3 decades. Hudson's death on the 2nd of October 1985 was a watershed. Funding for research increased. Media coverage exploded. The disease became real to mainstream America because someone they knew, someone whose face they'd loved, had died from it. But Hudson's announcement also outed him in the cruelest possible way. He couldn't control the revelation. couldn't frame it on his own terms. He was dying, and dying meant the truth coming out whether he wanted it or not. Every other closeted gay man in Hollywood watched and understood this could happen to them. The disease made the closet obsolete by making it deadly. The 1,990 seconds brought slow change. More actors came out, though still not many. Ellen DeGeneres' sitcom character came out in 1997, creating controversy that seems quaint now, but was seismic then. The Puppy episode, where Ellen Morgan announced she was gay, drew 42 million viewers, won Emmy Awards, and also led to the show's cancellation a year later. Coming out still meant professional risk, but the risk was becoming survivable. By the 2000s, openly gay actors could work, though usually in supporting roles, usually in independent films, usually not as romantic leads in mainstream Hollywood productions. Neil Patrick Harris came out in 2006 and his career continued. Zachary Quinto, Matt Bomer, Jim Parsons all came out while actively working. All continued working afterward. The change was real but limited. Certain roles remained off limits. Leading men in action films, romantic heroes in studio movies, those parts still required the appearance of heterosexuality. What was lost in all those decades of hiding? The relationships that were never photographed, existing only in memory and rumor. The love letters that were destroyed rather than archived, erased to protect reputations. The partnerships that lasted decades but were never acknowledged, leaving the surviving partner to mourn as a friend rather than spouse. The authentic lives that never got recorded because recording them meant risk. Montgomery Clift's journals, if they existed, were probably destroyed. Rock Hudson's correspondence with Mark Christian, burned or hidden. William Haines and Jimmy Shields built a life together, but how much of their private reality was preserved? Barbara Stanwyck and Joan Crawford, if their relationship was romantic, no evidence survived. The gaps in the historical record aren't accidental. They're the result of systematic erasure, of people making rational decisions to protect themselves by destroying proof of their own lives. What survived was the art. The performances endure because they were preserved on film, protected by the same industry that forced the hiding. We can watch Montgomery Clift in A Place in the Sun, see the intensity that came from living a split existence. We can watch Rock Hudson in Pillow Talk and understand the layers of performance, Hudson playing a character pretending to be someone else, while Hudson himself pretended to be someone else in real life. The irony is preserved in the celluloid even as the truth behind it was destroyed. The younger generation can't imagine the fear. Actors today who come out do so through Instagram posts or casual interview mentions. The drama is minimal, the professional consequences nearly non-existent. They work steadily, play romantic leads, live openly with partners who attend premieres with them. The transformation is so complete that explaining what it was like before seems like describing a different world. But that different world existed within living memory. Tab Hunter lived until 2018, long enough to see everything change. George Takei came out at 68, having hidden through decades of Star Trek fame, finally free to be honest. These men saw both worlds, the one where honesty meant destruction and the one where it meant liberation. Return to where we began. William Haines and Jimmy Shields in their Hollywood Hills home. Haines walked away from MGM in 1933, chose Jimmy over career, built something real through the refusal to hide. They had 50 years together. They created a successful business, designed homes for the same stars who couldn't acknowledge their relationship publicly. They proved another path was possible, even if almost nobody took it. When Haines died in 1973, Shields survived him only weeks. The grief was too enormous. The life they'd built together couldn't continue with half the partnership gone. They were buried together, their relationship acknowledged in death, as it couldn't fully be in life. The cameras have long stopped rolling. The studios that controlled them have crumbled or transformed beyond recognition. The morality clauses are gone. The manufactured romance is obsolete. The lavender marriages, historical curiosities. But the question remains, how many brilliant performances were we denied because people had to spend their energy hiding instead of creating? How many relationships never formed because the risk was too great? How many lives were lived in shadows rather than daylight? We'll never know. The ones who hid successfully are still hidden, their truths buried with them. The ones who were caught or forced out left fragmentary evidence, rumors, whispers, second-hand reports. Only a few left clear records. And even those records are incomplete, sanitized by executors and families who thought they were protecting legacies by hiding truth. What we're left with is the art and the absence, films that endure, performances that remain extraordinary, and beside them, the gaps where lives should be recorded. The greatest tragedy isn't that people had to hide. The greatest tragedy is that the hiding worked so well that entire existences vanished, leaving only the performances they gave on screen and the silence they maintained off it. They played lovers on screen while hiding their real lovers in shadows. They gave us romance while being denied their own. They were some of the most famous faces in the world, and also some of the loneliest people on earth. They created beauty while living in fear, made art while performing themselves, and paid for our entertainment with their authenticity. The price was too high. It always was. But they paid it anyway, because the alternative was worse, because hiding meant survival, because speaking meant losing everything. The courage that required is almost impossible to comprehend from this distance, from a world where coming out is a press release rather than career suicide. Remember them not just for what they gave us on screen, but for what they gave up to give us that. Remember the cost. Remember the hiding. Remember that every smile in every photograph might have been one more layer of performance in lives built on performance. Remember that we almost never knew them at all, and that the parts we did know were often the most carefully constructed fiction. The weight of secrets was crushing. The price of freedom came too late for most of them, but the art endures, and with it, the faint outline of lives that deserved to be lived openly but never were.